Hi, my name is Josh Atwell, and welcome to VeeamOn. I'm here to do a tech talk, and I have a pretty simple presentation here. What we want to talk about is designing past day zero. Now, the image that we have here, we really got a question. We see on this train, and this is a photo submitted by Duncan Epping on Twitter, but on this train, you have these lights, and these lights are uniform. However, it's clear that the color and the luminosity of each one of these lights has clearly changed. Now, the question that I had was this part of the original design, or was this a remnant, an artifact of things changing over time? Perhaps one of the shields around the light that broke at one point, and they replaced it, and the hue was slightly different, or perhaps they had applied different bulbs that caused the light to look different. But nonetheless, it's clear in this photograph that the lights are different, and it's unclear as to whether or not that was part of the plan. Now, the question is why does this matter? Well, in this framework, what you see is that there was a design and an architecture of how the light should be applied in the train. But because of the versatility of the framework or the light, frames, you were able to place different bulbs or different shields on that while it still functions and serves the purpose, it may not look like the original design, the way it was originally implemented on day zero. Now, throughout my career and working with numerous customers and being involved with the vBrownBag and other things, it's been very clear to me that a lot of times organizations often forget about that when they go to do a design, that you have to be cognizant of what happens after it's implemented. When you put something on the floor, you typically do a considerable amount of due diligence. You want to ensure that everything interoperates, that the code levels are accurate. You want to make sure that, if you're using jumbo frames, that it's consistent throughout. The intent is to ensure that when it is put into place, it is pristine, it is perfect, it fits the design. The question you should ask yourself is, what is this going to look like a year from now, in 365 days? Do you feel like you still have the same design when, let's say, for instance, you use Cisco UCS, and they release a new blade type, right? Now, introducing that new blade type changes the firmware that's required. It changes the feature sets, the speeds and feeds that are involved with that. It may even change the API that you integrate with. What kind of impact is that going to have in your overall environment as it rolls out to that change? So, in the remainder of the session, I want to hit on 3 points. My second slide, again, keeping it simple for all the VMUG folks out there who think that you need an elaborate slide deck. You don't. So, designing beyond day zero. The first thing that you want to consider is understanding the architecture's life cycle. And the first part of this is, when you're going to implement this architecture, how long are you intending on maintaining this framework or this architecture? Now, the reasons for that may vary. Most of the time, it's budget constrained. How long are these assets amortized, or how long is the lease, or how long are you responsible for keeping that equipment up? I believe the common is between 3 and 5 years, depending on what the infrastructure components are. Now, in thinking about that, you have to consider what might change over 3 to 5 years. And that's not specifically directed towards the workloads that's on there, but what might change as far as if your organization grows, you have new demands put on you, you have to implement new things in the future, or you have to expand this design, what would that expansion look like? Now, in thinking about that life cycle, the other part of it that you have to consider is, how do you manage code? How do you manage the firmware and the updates? Now, with some products out there, like conversion infrastructure frameworks, you're looking at things like VCE or Nutanix, where they are trying to actually take care of those things for you. They're handling part of that, day 365 problem, that day 730 problem, where you already know how that firmware update and that process is going to be. Now, if you're not using a framework like that, or perhaps you're using a reference architecture like NetApp FlexPod, SolidFire Agile Infrastructure, vSpecs, some of those things are still on you to ensure that you validate and test and guarantee that it's going to be right. Now, a lot of these these offerings, they are doing more and more work over time because they recognize that past day zero is still very important to maintain an understanding of the interoperability of all those components. okay? So when you're implementing a design, make sure you spend some time not just on what is it going to look like on the day that you deliver it, but how are you going to manage it over a period of time? Now, one strategy that you should absolutely approach when doing this is when you've determined the hardware that you're going to use and the software that you're going to implement on that, and you've identified what that is, you should make sure that you're communicating with the vendors for all the products that are part of that architecture. Right? Those guys have an idea of what their roadmap looks like. They know what products are coming in the near term. Generally, they'll be happy to have an NDA discussion with you to talk about what's coming in the future. A great example of why this is important is when you look at software-defined networking. Right? You're looking at the difference between Cisco's approach and VMware's approach. Before you make that decision and commit to one of those approaches, you clearly need to take some time, look at your use cases and the things that your architecture and your design is supposed to deliver, and just like you do with any other component, in the design and in that architecture, you have to make sure you're meeting those needs, and you make those selections accordingly. But don't just make the selection based on today's needs. You need to take some time and project into the future and identify the types of things that you think may be possible or that may come up. Because one thing that if you've been doing this for a while, you'll recognize is that as the business and the organization learns of the capabilities, they'll begin expanding those capabilities and asking for more complicated or more feature intensive things that they're going to want to take advantage of. Well, is your design going to be agile and flexible enough in order to absorb that? Right. One of the statements I made recently on the panel is that your architecture kind of needs to be able to bend without breaking, which means that as we saw in the previous photo, you could see that over time things are no longer working as what we anticipate was originally planned. However, the architecture is still serving its purpose. It's still providing the value that was anticipated and expected, but it was able to handle incremental change over time. All right, the third thing, understanding architectural agility. So back to the bend, not break. When you look at how to handle architectural agility, you need to look at the products that you're implementing in design and determine whether or not they have room to grow or whether or not they're rigid. Right? Do they have additional capabilities that they could take advantage of in upcoming releases? Going back to the roadmap discussion, getting an idea of what's possible or what they're considering to be possible. Right? Are you going to be able to make a transition from 10 gig to 40 gig on that platform? Is that going to be important? It may not be in that 3 to 5 year life cycle, but it's something you absolutely have to consider, because as we know, the investments that we make and that what we implement, they don't have to just meet the day 0. They have to meet day 365, day 730. Another great component in an architecture to consider when you look at agility is your storage. Now I won't, I'll put my solid fire thing away here, but I'll focus on the fact that when looking at storage, whether it is solid fire, EMC, or NetApp, you have to consider how is that going to grow? How do you anticipate consuming it? And if you consume it at a faster pace than what you intended, how far can you consume that? Right? Because most architectures have limits, and you have to understand those limits and design accordingly. Sometimes that may mean a larger upfront investment depending on the architectural framework for storage that you choose, but you have to make that decision and project it to the future, right? And understand, what is that process going to look like when you decide I need to grow this based on the growth and demands of the business, right? The last thing about architectural agility I want to add is in the maintenance aspect, right? How do you monitor? How do you maintain? How do you ensure that the design is sustainable? Because sustainability is extremely important in today's data center. Being able to ensure that the resources that you're providing to serve the business needs in those applications, that you're actually able to gain visibility and understanding of what's going on, and that the tool sets that you might look to incorporate and connect to that architecture and in that design, as part of that design, you also have a full life cycle and continue to grow over time. In the end, the most important thing is to remember you don't have a crystal ball. So when you look at doing your design and your architecture for your infrastructure and for the environment that you're building to serve resources to the applications, that you're doing so in a manner that over time you're going to have the flexibility to bend and not break. Because in the end, you've got to be able to deliver the service that's required regardless of changes in the framework or the components that are added. Thank you.